This picture is of the Jordan River. The Jordan is a modest-sized river, but it is the only river of substance in this region, and therefore it is the lifeblood of the region. The Jordan River finds its origins up at the base of Mount Hermon. It flows down into the Sea of Galilee, then out of the Sea of Galilee and down into the Dead Sea, which of course has no outlet. So the Jordan River is essential to life in Israel, and certainly essential to life around the Sea of Galilee. Jesus, of course, was baptized in the Jordan River. John the Baptist had his ministry there. That probably took place down at the south, near the outlet of the Jordan River at the Dead Sea. But today, people like to go sometimes to the Jordan River and be baptized in the waters of the Jordan River. The place to do that is right about the outlet of the Sea of Galilee. There's actually a site there set up for it because that's the only place where the Jordan River is now deep enough, because the water is being used, of course, for modern life. I should also say, as the Jordan River comes down into the Sea of Galilee, it is possible to go rafting on the Jordan River if you are so inclined. This is a marvelous aerial picture of Capernaum, Kfar Nahum, as they call it in modern Hebrew. And what you are seeing on the right is the great synagogue, and on the left of the very important ancient church and first century house. Here is the ancient synagogue of Kfar Nahum, Capernaum synagogue. If you remember, Jesus preached in the synagogue at Capernaum. What we can be quite sure of is that he did not preach in this synagogue. What you are seeing here, the white synagogue, that is limestone. This synagogue was built probably in the 3rd century, maybe even the early 4th century. So, and it is quite an extraordinary building. It's beautiful, very nicely done, but it was not there in the time of Jesus. You'll notice in the foreground that the dark stones are the native stone of the region. This is the near the Golan Heights. It's a volcanic region. The native stone of this region is the dark-colored volcanic basalt. The light-colored stone of the synagogue is limestone. That had to be imported, and that was quite an expensive undertaking that was done at a later time. So where is Jesus' synagogue then, you might ask? Well, it so happens that if you look carefully, you can see that it is on the same site as the white synagogue that is there now. Is simply underneath. The place to look would be the southwest corner of the synagogue, and if you look closely at the foundation, this is what you see. On top are the white limestone of the later synagogue, and underneath is the dark basalt foundation, and you'll notice that they do not line up with each other. They're slightly off kilter from one another. What does that say? It says that the dark foundation, the basalt building that was underneath, was already in place, and when they laid the new building, they slightly shifted the axis of the new building. Of course, if the black foundation, if the basalt foundation was built at the same time as the upper building, they wouldn't be off kilter from one another. So it tells us that the lower building was originally an earlier building, and the later limestone building was built on top of it. The Franciscans who run the site there at Capernaum have excavated inside under the floor of the white synagogue, and here is a depiction of what they have found. The rubble in the center, labeled 4, that is in blue, that is a first century layer. There was first century pottery found in that. The area labeled 2 is the later limestone synagogue. The rubble underneath, by the way, also 1 is from the modern, not modern, but the white limestone synagogue. The area labeled 3, that is the area underneath the white, once again, is that first century layer. And in fact, excavations then at the foundation trench of that foundation of the basalt structure did yield first century pottery. So in other words, the 3rd or 4th century limestone synagogue was in fact built on the site of the ancient synagogue where Jesus in fact was worshiping and speaking. This slide is of an early church that is not far from the synagogue, closer to the Sea of Galilee at Capernaum. It is an interesting structure. It is an octagonal structure built in two rings. The inner ring, the smaller octagonal structure, was the original church on this site. Some of the oldest churches ever built were in this octagonal style. And then later it was remodeled with the larger wall on the outside to give more space inside. This church probably dates to the 3rd century. The church isn't very important to us, except as a nice example of a very early church. What's important is that they chose to build the church on this particular site. Why did they do so? There is a very, very old tradition, apparently dating at least back to the 3rd century and probably earlier, that there was something special about this particular site. What's the something special? Not the church itself, but the stone structure you see underneath the church. So ignore the octagonal, 2 rings of octagonal walls, and look underneath and you will see a rectangular structure in the foreground and also in the background. Those are the foundations of a 1st century house. There are not that many 1st century houses here in Capernaum, so that's important in its own right. This is a 1st century house. This is a house that was here at the time of Jesus. Of that we can be sure. And remember that Jesus spent as much time at Capernaum as any other place, as far as we know, along the Sea of Galilee. According to the New Testament, when Jesus lived in Capernaum, he stayed at the house of Peter's mother-in-law. Is this Peter's mother-in-law's house? There seems to be an ancient tradition that says yes. That's why they built the church on this house and not on another one. We, of course, can't be certain, but there's only a few 1st century houses at this particular site. It is very probably one of them. You might remember this house from the New Testament, in particular the Gospel of Mark. Jesus was speaking in this house on one particular occasion. It was very crowded. Some people had a friend who was paralyzed. They tried to get him into this house to bring him to Jesus, and they couldn't get in. So if you remember what they did, they climbed up on the roof, ripped a hole in the roof, and you really could do that with ancient construction. It wasn't a big deal. And they lowered then the pallet down that had the paralyzed man on it, and famously Jesus said to him, and very interestingly, "Son, your sins are forgiven." Here is Bethsaida. Capernaum is on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee, just west of where the Jordan River enters the Sea of Galilee. About 6 miles to the east is Bethsaida, just east of where the Jordan River enters the Sea of Galilee. So Capernaum and Bethsaida are both very near each other on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee. This is the site of which I have been a field supervisor, an excavator, and researcher, and on the board of directors now for many years. You are looking in the distance at the tell. I might mention in the foreground are a couple of signs hanging off a barbed wire fence. Those signs say "Danger, Minefield." The reason for that is that in 1967, during the Six-Day War, this was ground held by the Syrian army, and they set up a mortar battery on top of Bethsaida. It was a good strategic place in the ancient world, and it was a good strategic place in the modern world. They planted landmines around the sides of this hill. And we faced a problem when we began to excavate here, because we were excavating up at the top, and down at the bottom, where this picture is taken from, is where the bathrooms were. After blowing up only a few students, we decided we probably wouldn't do that anymore. Okay, I'm fooling, we didn't blow up any students. We did call in the Israeli military, and they cleared the minefield. Eventually, we even got a bathroom set up top. So here is Bethsaida. Bethsaida is important for the New Testament. It is one of those places where Jesus spent a fair amount of time. We hear about him healing a blind man here, for example. In the Gospel of Luke, it mentions that the feeding of the 5,000 site was somewhere not far from here. Bethsaida was a very important city in the ancient world. Up on top of the tell, we have some 1st century remains. What you're looking at here is what we call the fisherman's house. It is a large courtyard house. You see on the right side of the slide the foundation of the wall for the courtyard. And you see an artist's reconstruction down below. So this is a courtyard house, then with rooms around the outside of the courtyard. Inside this house were found lead weights for nets, fish hooks, boat anchors, and other paraphernalia that would have been used for fishing. So we call this the fisherman's house. And of course, Bethsaida is the home, by the way, the word Bethsaida means house of the fishermen. Bethsaida was the home of some of the most famous fishermen in history, namely Peter and Andrew. Peter and Andrew, of course, were fishermen on the Sea of Galilee. Also, according to the Gospel of John, Philip was from Bethsaida. There's also a reference in the Gospel of John that suggests that maybe Nathanael also was from Bethsaida. And if you remember, Peter and Andrew were in a fishing partnership with James and John, which suggests maybe James and John were also from Bethsaida. If that is true, at least 3 and as many as 6 of the original 12 apostles were from Bethsaida. And the word Bethsaida means house of the fishermen. Here's a fisherman's house. The pieces fit together pretty well. Right next door to the fisherman's house is another courtyard house. I should tell you, when the Syrians were here installing their mortar battery in 1967, they ran bulldozers around the top of this tell, so they sort of ripped up some sections. You can see this courtyard on the upper left has a whole section of it that was ripped out by those bulldozers. But nevertheless, the walls around the outside are in place. Several of the walls that represent the individual rooms, you can see at the very top, an artist's depiction in the bottom left. Here is another house right next door to the fisherman's house, another nice courtyard house from the period. This would be the high rent district of Bethsaida. This building has a very strange structure sticking out the back of it. You can see it in the artist's depiction on the lower right, and you can see it on the slide on the lower right, what it looked like when we first discovered it. We discovered it in 1994. It happened to be my first year excavating at Bethsaida, and I was there with a colleague from our religion department. We found these stone beams covering some sort of structure that was surrounded by stone walls that had a small opening large enough for a person to go down into it. We had no idea what it was. There were very few parallels, and so my colleague decided that he would excavate out this structure, whatever it was. So he excavated in there for 3 weeks, and what he finally discovered when he got down to the bottom was some broken pottery. Not very broken and easily reconstructed, and here's what he found. He found a bunch of wine jars. So this structure was a wine cellar. So they now call this the winemaker's house or the wine cellar house. Notice that these wine jars are of local manufacture. That's important because it suggests that this person was drinking wine made in the local area. By the way, to this day, the Golan Heights in Israel is good wine country. The local wine would not have been of terribly high quality, but one would drink local wine because one wants to keep kosher. This would be kosher wine in all probability. Interestingly, next door, the fishermen also drank wine. Of course, everybody drank wine in the ancient world, and we have wine jars from his house as well. But what we find at the fisherman's house next door is that we have imported wine jars. Some of the best wine in the Roman Empire was imported to that particular house, and so you have this strange phenomenon where two people are living right next door to each other. One has a wine cellar, one does not. The one who has the wine cellar drinks the lousy local wine. The one who does not have the wine cellar drinks the good stuff. Go figure. According to Josephus, around about the year 30 AD, the city of Bethsaida was renamed Julius in honor of the wife of the Roman Emperor Augustus. Augustus had died earlier, but Julia, also called Livia, died in 29. When she died, in all probability, as had happened with Augustus, she came to be considered divine. This city, Herod Philip, who ruled this area, renamed this city Julius in her honor. Remember, the Herods were tightly connected with the Augustus family, so you can understand how he would want to do this in honor of Julia. We see here a structure that was built during that period of time, probably in 30. It is a temple, a modest Roman temple, probably of the imperial cult. And you can see the woman doing the measurements is standing on one of the long walls of the temple, and you can see the bottom right, our chart of the plan of the temple. We're looking kind of down through the middle of the temple, and you can see the transverse walls in the foreground. Where I'm standing when I take this picture was discovered a couple of important things. On the bottom left, we found an ornate bronze incense shovel that seemed to have been used in worship, imperial worship, and we also found a statue, probably a small statue, a figurine with a unique hairdo that was typical of Julia. So here we have a very interesting moment in time. The city of Bethsaida is being renamed, its status is being elevated, a temple to the imperial cult worshiping the wife of the emperor is being built in this town at precisely the time Jesus was in town. And so you get this interesting juxtaposition. As Bethsaida reaches the height of its, if you will, secular status, Jesus comes to town talking about his kingdom that is not of this world.